Welcome back to Business Week here on Arise News. To get into some of this week's top business headlines with me is Dr. Teriba, Chief Executive Officer of Economic Associates, where he leads ongoing research and consulting on global, continental, national, subnational, and corporate issues, amongst others. Thank you so much for joining me this morning, Dr. Ayo. It's so good to see you.
Good morning.
So we saw there just a minute ago the clip of the president delivering his speech to the National Assembly. What we have is a 20 trillion naira budget. What, for you, were some of the highlights?
Oh, well, that's the president's 8th budget proposal and his final one, expected to kick in January. And we will preside over the first 5 months of that budget, and you'll expect that his successor will have to deal with the remaining 7 months of the budget. What's new? How is this different from any of the previous budget that we've seen, particularly in the last 2-3 years? Not much is new. We've been here before. So it's easy, to deal with it. You are not doing anything different, and therefore you shouldn't expect any different outcome. And the first place to start is that, oh yes, 20 trillion budget sounds big. That should solve some problems for the country. But you first have to discount it by the amount that the president has disclosed is going to spend on interest payments, which is in excess of 6 trillion. So non-debt spending from this 20.5 trillion budget is only about,
so if I may ask
14 trillion.
If I may ask you, that's a huge amount to spend on debt. So how exactly are we going to fund this budget? How are we going to fund it?
Oh, well, the president says that we will get revenue of about 10 trillion. But you also have to discount that with the interest payment. So if your revenue is 10 trillion, you are paying 6 trillion in interest, you're effectively left with 4 trillion in revenue to fund 14 trillion in non-debt spending. So the chances are that we'll repeat the experiences of recent years, that we would not be able to meet even recurrent spending with the revenue left. To meet recurrent spending, we'll need to borrow. And to do any type of capital spending, it will have to be funded by borrowing. Therefore, that 14 trillion is not likely to materialize. You'll be lucky if you get to spend 10 trillion at the end of the day. The key problem, well, two problems really, is, and this is for the next administration to address, how can Nigeria find more revenue to fund the budget? Number one. And number two, how can Nigeria eliminate that huge debt costs, from the budget? So that when you announce budget of 20 trillion or 30 trillion, it's on face value. You don't have to discount anything. If you announce that you're getting revenue of 10 trillion, it's on face value. You don't have to discount, what you pay, on interest payment.
Yeah, so, look, the question of how Nigeria is going to generate revenue, are we then going to expect more tax, new fiscal policies at state, national level, or how exactly, where is that money going to come from?
Very good question. Now, the realities of the global environment, or the realities of, the trends of, for example, commodity prices, which I guess we should also discuss shortly.
That, yes.
The global equity index is such that focusing on income alone is something that had worked when you were sure that commodity prices were only going to get better going forward. In this climate, where commodity prices are most likely to disappoint, you don't focus too much on income, whether the income of government, say from crude exports, or income of the private sector. the world, the economy is not just about income. The economy is also about assets. So when income disappoints, you turn to assets for revenue. Nigeria is very rich in assets. So it's not just GDP and taxing GDP, but we have wealth that we could call, into operation that we are not calling into operation. I'll give you the example. Saudi has turned to Aramco, listed Aramco in the stock market, and its fortune is no longer tied to what happens to oil price. It's, Aramco, the developments with the valuation of Aramco on the global scene, gives it, easier entrance into global capital markets. So Nigeria should start thinking what they can get, from non-tax, non-income sources, and try and get more from the assets that we have. We also have companies, none of them is listed. We are hoping to list the NNPC after this government goes, which we should have listed NNPC at the beginning of this regime.
Well, let's hope that
ago.
policy of the NNPC becoming more commercially focused continues. But I have to ask you, one of the old age tensions we've had with the budget is the balance between recurrent expenditure and capital expenditure. Based on this current budget, are you satisfied that the government is getting that balance right, given the huge amounts of capital projects and infrastructure projects that this economy needs?
Right. Well, the government is not promising to spend more on capital than recurrent.
Sure.
Government is promising, it will spend more on recurrent and spend a little over 5 trillion on capital.
Yeah.
But the experience in the last few years is that the government is likely to overshoot its recurrent spending
expenditure,
and undershoot the capital spending.
I mean, Dr. Teriba, I know because we're short of time, I want to get your comment on the crude benchmark and then tied to your thoughts on the global oil climate, particularly in light of what OPEC has just come out with. Is Nigerian benchmarking right where we are? Very quickly.
It's not so much about the crude benchmark. $70, I have no problem with. What I do have problem with is the output that has been assumed. Is Nigeria going to bring 1.6 million barrels?
Yes.
With all the conversation about crude oil theft and the rest of it. So the uncertainty comes from us. It doesn't come from the global scene. Oil price had been $100 or more. It didn't benefit us because we claimed that oil was being stolen.
Right.
So the uncertainty is with us. Are we going to be able to stop crude theft? Most of the uncertainties are with us. Are we going to be able to, for example, revenue, are we going to be able to end the regime of tax waivers? The president says that the subsidy regime is unsustainable. Are we going to do anything about it? And as the closer you get to the election, the more difficult
those issues become.
It is to do anything
Absolutely.
About this.
I mean, these are quite some interesting issues to grapple with. Let's see how things materialize. As always, it's been great speaking with you, Dr. Ayo Teriba, CEO of Economic Associates. Thank you very much for your time.
You.
Thank you.